Brilliant. Well, I think most people are here. So welcome everyone this afternoon. This is the State of Agile Culture panel discussion, and it's in partnership with the Agile Business Consortium, JCURV and Truthsayers. So my name's Pyle and I'm your host this afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us. So the State of Agile Culture report was actually published in 2020. And the report, which we're going to share the link in the chat if people haven't read it, if you haven't read it, covered a number of themes and topics. A couple of them were, companies that have a strong agile culture actually outperform those companies that don't by 235% in business performance. But also talked about how organizations that have a strong agile culture start talking about the importance of teams versus the individual. It also covered that it takes time to build culture, but actually it's worth it. And then there was also some sector comparisons of how banking is actually quite further ahead versus other industries and sectors, such as public sector and education. So, it's interesting to think about why that's happening. But I guess as you read that report, it's really clear that the business case is strong in terms of why organizations should have a strong agile culture. And so the focus of this afternoon is to think about what practically can be done to strengthen, agile culture in an organization. And I'm joined by, some fantastic panelists that are going to help bring to life their experience and also some of the things that they've tried, tested, and maybe failed on in their organization. But before I introduce our panelists this afternoon, we wanted to just ask you guys a question. So if we launch the poll, please, Emily. So the question here is, what do you see as the biggest impediment to strengthening the agile culture in your organization? And you can only select on one. So really think about, the thing that's going to make is the biggest challenge. So if you just take a moment to read through the options, that would be great. Cool, I'll just give you 10 more seconds. And then Emily, if you don't mind sharing the results. Really interesting to see what's come through. Emily, should we share? Fantastic. So hopefully you can see that on your screen, but 33% are saying that actually it's a lack of leadership awareness that is the biggest impediment. And then kind of just behind that is low organizational agile capability and awareness. So we'll definitely come back to those topics. And what I'd encourage you all to do is we've got the chat functionality. So please kind of put your questions, put your comments into the chat functionality, and I will definitely try and get to our panelists and get their insights on some of it. So, and this is your session, so, please make sure that you leave with something that's practically going to help you as we as you go back to your day jobs tomorrow. So let me introduce our amazing panelists this afternoon. So we've got panelists covering banking, to the retail sector, to kind of working across sectors. So Amanda, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us, where you're from? But also it would be great just to get your perspectives on, what do you see as the benefits of, having a strong agile culture?
Thanks, Pyle. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. I'm Amanda. I'm a freelance lean enterprise coach. So I basically work with different organizations to support them to adopt organizational agility, business agility. So rather than seeing it's just something that lives within the world of tech, it's something that can be adopted a bit more widely. I cut my teeth working at Moonpig originally, and since then I've been working with Gusto, the recipe box company, and at the moment with OVO Energy. In terms of the benefits from a strong agile culture, I like to describe it as being better, faster, and happier. So better meaning better products and services that are customer centric and generate a better return on investment. Faster, you get those products and services to market faster, you get feedback on them. That's part of what feeds the ability to create those better products and services. And finally, happier. So it's a more sustainable way to work. It's a much more engaging and more motivating way to work. And happier employees tends to lead to happier customers as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amanda, and great to have you with us this afternoon. Dan, if I could come to you, it'd be great just to hear, where you're from, Dan. But the question I have to you is, the State of Agile Culture survey found that, organisations outperform those that don't in the strong culture by 235%. I mean, that's a pretty big number. Do you relate to that?
Hey, Pale. Hi, guys. My name's Dan Wilson. I work with Lloyds Banking Group, so I'm in the financial services world. I actually helped roll in kind of the agile culture over the course of the last 6-7 years across the organisation. So I've been a transformation lead within LBG, and in doing so as a product owner for a couple of years of my learning experience. From my point of view, I think building on what Amanda said, actually, I think certainly it does resonate with me. The 235%. I'm not sure entirely on the metric, but I think that's part of the fun with agile is actually how do you prove some of the improvements. And certainly within LBG, we can see improvements to what we do in terms of making things better. So actually some of our products now are definitely a lot better than they were before for our consumers and for our customers. We're certainly able to pivot and move faster. COVID-19 has been a fantastic experience in some ways because it's pulled some of that forward. The thought of not having teams running an agile prior to the last year really does scare me even more from a business point of view. So I think ability for us to be able to pivot and move to what our customers wanted has been fundamentally really helped through our movement to agile. And then happier, certainly, not only just from a consumer and customer point of view, we see it through some of the take-up rates on our products because of that speed and improvements to the product, but also for our colleagues. The people who are working this way and have done for a long time, certainly it seems to be more fun and much more aligned to the customer. Hard work, but definitely worth it in the end. So from my point of view, that does turn into pounds, shillings and cents, as they say.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's music to so many people's ears, Dan. Thank you, and great to have you this afternoon. Richard, if I could come to you, welcome. And it would be great, Richard, to understand a little bit from your perspective of what are the attributes of having a strong agile culture in an organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. Evening, Carl. Thank you, and evening to everyone else. Rich Gange. I'm responsible for the Scrum Master capability at Hargreaves Lansdown. Hargreaves Lansdown, for those people that don't know, a leading investments platform. We're based in Bristol. Attributes of an agile culture. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I guess I've got a few answers. One's a bit of a cheat answer, a couple of quite cliche answers, and a couple more in HL terms. My cheat answer is leadership awareness. I've just taken that straight from the poll, but that's absolutely bang on. I think that's so important. Having that leadership awareness is integral to a good agile culture. My couple of quite cliche ones are around having a focus on the people and the interactions. I think that's huge, and people form such a big part of good agile culture. And then around that customer collaboration in HL terms, we very much talk about putting the client first and having good, strong client outcomes central to everything that we do. That's absolutely what we should be focused on. They're my kind of headline answers, I suppose.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard, and look forward to getting more of your perspectives later. Hi, Simon. Welcome. Simon, as you introduce yourself, it'd be great to understand, how has COVID kind of helped or hindered in building that agile culture in your organisation?
Yeah, hi everyone. Simon Pakenham-Walsh. My background is consultancy, but I ran all the change teams across Sainsbury's for 4 years, and most recently I've been at Arcadia. So I've been at Arcadia during the COVID time. So I'm not sure I can give as positive an answer as everyone else is giving for experience during COVID, given where Arcadia is right now. But there are definitely some things that COVID taught us and strengthened the agile culture. I think it showed that companies can change when focused on the same goal, irrespective of how reticent they were to change before. And it shows that change can change fast. I think Arcadia was very much a a paper-based organization, very hierarchical. And actually, you know, when that was completely taken away, when there was no way that you couldn't have the same outcome, change can move very fast. And lastly, you know, technology moved right up the agenda. It became really important, and I think technology is really exciting at the moment. Systems are more accessible than ever before, and data is more democratized than ever before. So actually, the challenge is really how fast can you do it. The challenge is a people thing, and that is where Agile comes in. So I think that's really critical. And I think if I look at, I guess, more of the negatives of what we learned through COVID, is that the decisions that were trying to be made through COVID were decisions that we put on the table before. And there were decisions actually that JCURV had helped us come to before we'd even got to COVID. And just that reticence of change, that reticence to make a decision quickly, I believe was quite a big contributor to the ultimate downfall of such a, you know, a group that had so much potential.
Brilliant. Thanks for your honesty there, Simon. And we'd love to explore that a little bit more about, you know, your learnings of how, you know, organisations can avoid some of that going forwards as well. Vikram, welcome to the panel this afternoon. It'd be great, as a question to you, is, you know, you're working across multi-industries, multi-types of organisations. You know, what have you seen as the benefits of having a strong Agile culture?
So hi, afternoon. Thanks so much for spending your time with us over the next hour. My name is Vikram. I'm the Managing Director of JCURV. I guess from my perspective, as a consultant, as a transformation consultant, I guess that the importance of Agile from what I've seen is three things really. It's sustainability, lower friction, and I guess outperformance. And I'll give you an example of, we've probably done, what, 10 transformations at, like, let's say FTSE 100 scale. And what's been fascinating is through some experiments, we introduced Agile through, you know, the typical kind of training, competency, technical skills perspective. And we've done experiments where we've just introduced culture behaviors and see what happens with the teams. The most sustainable change we've made are those ones where we introduce the behaviors, the values, the principles. Those teams seem to sustain it a lot better than just introducing the tools and techniques. And I think that's the key part. And, you know, what we're tremendously proud of is making sure that whatever we do sticks. So, you know, from a cultural perspective, the importance comes through to sustainability. And with that sustainability, you're going to get outperformance as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Vikram. So like I said at the start, you know, please ask your questions, use the chat functionality, and hopefully we'll come to a few of them later on in this session. But I just wanted to start with, you know, clearly there's a really strong case that I'm hearing from all of you that, you know, having a strong Agile culture is really beneficial. You know, you get happy customers, happy products and services. So it'll be great to just explore some of the practical levers and tools and techniques to actually make this happen. Like, where do you start? So Amanda, if I could come to you first, but what would you say are some of the key levers in strengthening an Agile culture and the behaviours in an organisation?
I think it's really interesting what Vikram was just saying about the work you've been doing around the principles and the behaviours, because I think that really the behaviours, the principles and the expectations you set for people are critical, because I think that's one of the biggest barriers to change is the people that you've actually got. And when you talk about having an Agile culture, you actually need to hire for that culture. And I think, you know, one of the challenges is, particularly if you're in the transformation space, is you're now transforming to a culture which you didn't hire people for. But equally, you know, I've focused mainly on working with organisations that were, to a degree, born and bred in the Agile world and have actually sort of started off down the Agile path and are still struggling. To give you an example of where I'm working at the moment, you've got a very strong Agile leadership team, but actually not a particularly Agile culture. And really, when you start analysing why that is, it's because the expectations and the behaviours are not really clear. That the leadership have an idea of the culture that they want, but they've not necessarily articulated and put the sort of expectations in place. And I found this in several places. And I think a really practical thing you can do is to embed this in your career framework. So your career framework and your growth and your promotion process, your recruitment, everything hangs around this. So it's not just about the skill you have in a particular discipline. It is about these behaviors and attributes that support an agile culture. And it's no good being highly skilled in what you do. If the culture fit isn't there, you're really not going to be an asset to the organization. So really defining what your culture is, what behaviors you expect, and then holding people accountable to them. Because I think the other thing the organizations will fall foul of was, oh, well, such and such is so good, we really can't lose them, and therefore we'll excuse the behaviors that we don't really see. And once you do that, then you start to corrupt and dilute your culture, because what you're saying is actually it's opt-in. We'd like you to behave in an agile way, but it's kind of voluntary.
Super interesting. And thinking about recruiting for mindset as much as tools and capability, like you said. Simon, if I could come to you, given that you've had some experiences of agile working well versus some where it hasn't taken off, do you see that there's anything different that needs to be done to like a normal culture change program in strengthening agile? What are the differences and some of the pitfalls that we should be mindful of?
Yeah, I think firstly, if you hear snoring, it's not me, it's my pug dog. So if you hear that, apologies, but I'll make sure I speak loudly so that at least I'm a little bit louder than she is. But I think the key thing about agile is it's building on what Amanda said. There's no silver bullet, and there's no one thing that's going to work for everyone. So I think the key thing to make it work, and I've seen it not work, and I've seen it work. So I'm sort of talking from experience here. You need to be open to re-examining everything that goes on in your entire business. So everything across people, process, technology. And I think you need to ultimately create a capability that allows you to recognize a need and then prioritize it and then act on it. And from what I've seen, I think where I've seen it work well, I've seen it work well where it's top down and bottom up. And I think a change program sometimes has lots of phases, and it rolls out, and it's a project plan, and the scope is fairly well understood. I don't think you can do that with Agile. You need to be ready to react to whatever hits you. And the best way I've seen that, working with JCURV at Sainsbury's was a good example where Mike Coote, CEO, was very much a supporter of it, because he knew how much disruption it was going to cause across the business, and it gave people that permission to take chances and to really go with it. And that worked really well. But equally, we used really good people in our teams to start to deliver against it. So that sort of pincer movement worked really well. And then it was just, let's figure out as it goes. Let's not get too worried that there isn't a plan. There needs to be clear outcomes. There needs to be understood. We need to be measuring against everything. But we don't have a project plan. We have some goals that we want to go towards, but we don't have a project plan. Whereas when you look at some of my other experiences, and you can probably guess the companies, it was great when everything was going well. There was a real support for it. But when everything wasn't going well, it reverted back to type, and it went, well, hang on, where's the plan? What's happened? What's gone wrong? I want to see what's happened. Whereas there wasn't that permission. And therefore people retracted back into their shells. And then you start to get this blame culture, and that's where it really falls over. So I think it needs to be a bit of both. And as I said, I think you need to be, I'm going to steal someone else's phrase, but comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's a really great phrase, and it's one I've used a lot of times since it came up, because being comfortable with ambiguity is the critical element.
Sure, thanks, Simon. I'll come back to a couple of things that you said there, and it would just be good to open up to any of the panelists actually. But in that time of challenge, when things are going badly, how do you retain that agile culture, that mindset, versus reverting to type? Has anyone kind of got any perspectives on that?
I think from my perspective, just sort of give my opinion on it, I think this is where you need to be brave. And I think if you're protecting your job, you're not going to do very well at it. I think this is where you need to just do the right thing and protect people where you think they are doing the right thing and give them that license. It's all about empowerment. Ultimately, it's all about building trust, and trust can only be built up through delivery of those outcomes. So you need to buy them enough time to build up that, to gain that trust, to earn that credibility. And I think that's what, as leaders, you need to try and do. You need to try and figure out whether it's, you know, you can do it in a hidden way if you want, to try and just give people that confidence and that credibility, because then you can unveil it if you feel there isn't that culture up at the top. Clearly, it's much better to have the culture top down, but if you don't, then you almost need to do it in a hidden way so that you can go, look, we've been doing this behind the scenes, these are the results, this is what you can do, give us another small area that we can work with, and then just let it snowball from there.
Brilliant. Richard, any perspectives? I'll come to you just after that, Vikram.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts were made. So can I just start by going back to what Amanda said about bringing people in on skills and attributes and focusing on the attributes and the behaviours. I think that's bang on the money, Amanda. I think that's the way we're often looking at it within our group, is very much focusing on the attributes of those behaviours as opposed to a skill, which is something that you can acquire and you can develop in time. The attributes being that kind of thing that's inherent to the individuals. I think that's a really good point, and I totally agree with that. To what Simon was talking about there in terms of reverting to type, and it comes back to what the culture is. I think one of the biggest impediments that I see is legacy, and what that legacy looks like in practice. I guess it has a number of different flavors, but we need to have the culture to make it safe to challenge that legacy. It's safe to experiment and really challenge those individuals whose inclination based on legacy is to revert to what they know best. That's when I think about impediments, I think it's that legacy and almost the people within that's one of the biggest challenges.
Thanks, Richard. And then Vikram, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I guess in terms of this, when times are tough, everyone reverts to type. Some of the experiences that we've had, which helps, and it is very hard, isn't it? I think you've got to acknowledge that, let's just say the leaders, if we're talking about them, they've been very successful for 20, 30 years, suddenly being told or potentially given the light that they can do things differently, it's hard to undo that, to unlearn these things. But what we've seen really powerful is that to visualize the behaviors. So we do this a lot, which is work with the leadership team to define what the behaviors are, which will help them go on their journey. And then secondly, we visualize them. So we measure the behaviors on a monthly basis, and we're getting the leadership teams to do the retrospectives and say, well, let's just say one of the behaviors that you had is that it's, maybe it's okay to fail or something like that, or learn fast and fail often or whatever it is. We visualize that and we constantly check in on those behaviors. So even when it comes down to when it's getting tough and people are feeling a bit uncomfortable, we're constantly reviewing against, okay, this is what we said we were going to do. Let's hold to that. What we're going to do differently to kind of achieve a different outcome. And that has a big impact. And I guess link back to Amanda's point, which is it's important that the leaders are defining up front what are the behaviors which are going to help the organization increase their agility. And at least you've got a framework to kind of measure yourself against, rather than it just being a bit looser and then suddenly you just go back to the broader, more generic kind of company values and principles and behaviors.
Thank you, Vikram. Dan, anything to add? I can see you're nodding.
Yeah, I think just seeing some of the conversations come up in the thread, I think for me, where we've seen success, first of all, we've definitely seen experimentation being one of the key things. So I think as Simon was just explaining, I think if you can find an area through an advocate, an exco, or somebody who will sponsor it to keep the umbrella covering you from some of the harder questions, I think that certainly worked really well within Lloyds, where we started off small. We tried to find the attributes, Richard, that we thought were the right ones for people. So people who are maybe a little bit more growth mindset, and we let them get on with it, and ultimately gave them some space to test and learn, and then infect the system. And just looking at some of the threads that have come through, I think one of the things for me around it, if you haven't, I'd encourage all of you guys to have a look at systems thinking and Deming's way. So there's a massive part, you'll see it if anyone says like the NHS before COVID and some of the metrics and measures we put in. Yeah, absolutely. Lloyds was culpable of measuring the wrong thing, but thinking it was in control. And so what we're seeing now being successful is the organization is realizing Agile isn't about a change program. Agile is how you work, is actually how you drive the business. It isn't, and I think that's where people have got confused. It tends to start in your transformation divisions or in your project areas, but ultimately it's about running a business and doing it in the most effective way. And that's where I'm seeing, certainly within my organisation now, that top to bottom alignment to say, hang on a sec, our mobile app is our business. But that takes time. Before it was something someone else did, but now they're sort of, well, hang on, this is actually how we deliver our product. And I guess all businesses are slightly different. Amanda's got experiences of very different ones, but certainly in a big organisation, doing it in some small sectors has held real benefit. And I think COVID, going back to Simon's bit, having the burning platform could only have helped sharpen that for people, because ultimately, if you've got a common purpose as an organisation, it makes life a lot easier. I think this year and later years are going to be really interesting when organisations don't have a common problem to solve, because it actually really sharpened things up for a lot of people, I think, during the last year in terms of what we're here for. So anyway, that was what I was thinking about.
And then just maybe building on that, Dan, so you've talked a little bit around, start with some experimentation, but, how do you start the journey of kind of building your agile culture? So, I've seen it quite often where, the principles of agile are being applied to, like the Scrum, Kanban is being used in an organization, but that's quite different, as to building the agile culture. So how what are some of the practical tips of where do you start in building that culture?
So I think certainly what we found useful, and this is where we're kind of scale to descale our organization, was starting with the individuals that stood out in the organisation, maybe a bit more colourful, maybe a bit different, certainly within a kind of staid organisation like my own, or previously, people did stand out who had that certain mindset that said actually we're up for trying something different. And then, as I said, having a sponsor that would kind of allow that team to flourish was important. I think the interesting thing for us within Lloyds Banking Group, very few of the teams that originally started in practicing agile ways of working had ever done it before. So we supplemented it with teams like Vikram, like JCURV, or actually other suppliers. And yes, we learned on paper the agile manifesto is the way I describe it. What was great was we started to run ceremonies, daily shouts, sprint planning, staring at your show and tells, spending time in the work, not in the governance. But actually, it was only through doing it would you understand actually as an individual what those things meant. Because behaviourally you got it, intellectually you got it, but you had to do it to practice it. And then as you started to do that, the more and more you practice those tools and techniques, the more you realise it is the way to do it. There isn't another way, and you can't go back. I don't know how many I'm seeing some nods around the table is, you can't go back to how you thought before, because it's just making work visual and visible is just such an easier way to work. So I think the way I've seen it work well there was that that's how we did it, is actually try and get the right fit of people, but then actually start doing it and practicing it. And as you do that, you rapidly over 2, 3, 4 sprints, you start to see results, mistakes, etc. Some of the team hate it and they're like, we're out, and they generally did. People really surprised me. People I thought would flourish, hated the way of working. But ultimately that's where we saw success, was actually practicing it. And then you kind of, I don't know about those of you who started working agile about 6 months later, went, oh, now I really do understand why I do look at those metrics. Whereas before you got it, but you didn't really get it. So part of it is about actually practicing what you preach, and you learn as you move.
I think to add to that, actually, I think that you also get some people who are actually pretty agile already and don't realize they are. And sometimes those are the people who are the real evangelists. So you do sometimes get, and I completely agree with you, Dan, that you need to get the people who can start to, spread the virus, start to really spread that word through the business. But then you'll get some people, and in retail, you see it a lot actually, because retail is very much a people business. You'll get people who are just very good at chatting to other people. And if you can give them a few tools, give them a few frameworks that they can use, they just pick it up instantly, and they have that rapport with everyone. They have that ability to speak on and be on their feet. And that's where it really spreads really quickly. So it's really exciting to see the areas that you wouldn't expect it to pick up. It picks up sometimes the fastest, and sometimes the digital areas where people think they're really agile and think they know everything are sometimes the hardest to change, because they already have these opinions. It's quite similar to trying to teach someone something brand new when they've got no experience of it, and teaching someone where they think they've got everything. Actually, it's sometimes easier to do the first.
Really impactful. Richard, maybe just a question. I know you're going to make a comment, but I'll ask it now and then you can answer both. Someone's asked the question of, in financial services, is it really acceptable that leaders experiment, in a regulated environment? If that's one of the levers of an agile culture, is that just a pipe dream?
Yeah, so if I can come back to that, just to build on a couple of points that have been made, I think Simon, you're making a really interesting point there about people not knowing necessarily they're agile, but actually kind of seeing it play out in front of them, thinking, actually, I think this might sound slightly controversial, but I think so much of this is about common sense. And I think, okay, there's some frameworks out there that put structure around it, but for me, it's about putting structure around common sense. So we have 35 teams at HL, and the majority using Scrum. Now, Scrum prescribes certain ceremonies, but really what it's prescribing there is just common sense. Let's have that kind of daily check-in, have a little chat, see what's blocking us. Maybe after a certain amount of time, we'll get together and see if there's anything we can do to do better as a team. And we should probably present what we're doing to our stakeholders every couple of weeks as well. There's so much of it there that's common sense. And I think, so to the point you're making there, Simon, yeah, there's people that don't necessarily think they prescribed it, but when they see it play out, they're like, actually, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So kind of interesting on that point. In financial services, can leaders experiment? Yeah, really, really interesting question. And like, you don't need me to tell you that financial services is heavily regulated, but that doesn't mean that there's not scope for that experimenting. We deal with quite a lot of fixed deadline work, more than one would choose, and some quite fixed scope work. But there's definitely scope within the way that we deliver that and how we deliver value to clients to experiment and to really challenge on what those deliveries look like and how they're shifting the dials on client value. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's very easy to raise that question and to be constrained by that. But yeah, there definitely is that scope. Absolutely.
And just to build on that, Richard, this experimentation with, let's say, products with the customer, etc., is one element. We regularly encourage the leaders that we work with to experiment with behaviours as well. So, as I was saying before, we try and get the leaders to basically define a set of behaviours they want to role model. And obviously, we're not expecting them to suddenly transform overnight. We get them to pick and identify one behaviour which is they're scoring low on, and then we'll say, okay, well, what are you going to do in the next 30 days which you can experiment a new behaviour? As an example, with a leadership team we're working with right now in financial services, they're experimenting with just empowerment and delegation, for the 30 days. And, it can be quite serious because they're saying, actually, now I'm going to stop giving them my advice and telling teams what to do because I may have more experience and expertise. So it can be a little bit risky and they feel quite uncomfortable for it, but they've been constantly surprised about what the teams can come back with, which they never even thought about as well. So I think experimentation can be seen as a behavioural as well as looking at particular products too.
Cool, thank you, Vikram. Amanda, you've worked across different sectors and industries. Someone's asked a question a little bit in the education sector of, how can one implement Agile in the education sector, especially when people aren't that well versed in Agile, but, not necessarily education, but what's your experience of, kind of just getting started and some of the simple things that can be done?
Yeah, I think, first of all, people tend to perceive Agile as a tech thing. So the first reaction is, oh, this is a tech thing. It's not relevant to me. Also, it quite frequently gets sold to them as, oh, you do daily stand-ups and, you work in sprints and all this kind of thing. And, ultimately Agile is about a set of principles. It's how you apply them in a specific context. So I find it's useful to start with a shared definition of Agile, which has got nothing whatsoever to do with sprints, stand-ups, or any kind of methodology, because those things are tools, right? You pull them off the shelf as and when they're useful, but they're frankly optional. And actually what works best is if you can design and tailor your own process and pick up things from frameworks and methodologies that are helpful and use them. There's no point reinventing the wheel, but you've got to be a little bit pragmatic about it as well. So I think having a shared definition of what do we actually mean by agile, what are we trying to achieve, and use that as the starting point. I think something else that's helpful is the good old retrospective, basically getting people just to surface the things that are frustrating them and start talking about what could we do differently, what, you know, within our small sphere could we be doing differently, you know, just starting to breed that continuous improvement mindset, because there tends to be quite a lot of apathy as well. You know, people love moaning about stuff, they're not so great about taking action and doing something differently. And I think the great things about retrospectives is you're actually ring fencing time to go, how could we do things better, what doesn't work, what don't we like, and what could we do differently. And I think that is a really, really simple way to start surfacing problems, start talking about what you could do differently, and you can begin to build from there. I think beyond that, in terms of how you go about it, I think you just really have to understand the context. You know, what is it people are doing, what's the kind of work that they do, who are their customers. You've got to have that, you know, that broader context to start thinking, you know, to start supporting people in terms of, okay, what might agile working look like in your environment? Because it, you know, it is hard if you're starting from scratch with no knowledge of it. You know, I'm working with a customer support team at the moment, you know, who are trying to be more agile. They're starting from scratch. Mm-hmm. You know, they're going to need a little bit of guidance, but it's, you know, helping connect what agile is all about to their world, and then working with them to go, okay, you know, how do we connect these things up, what makes sense in your context, and also articulating very loudly and very clearly that this is an evolution, this will not work first time, we'll try something, we get some feedback on it, and then we start building. So let's get something up and running, let's get something working, and then keep improving it.
Cool. I just want to open up to the audience. There's a great question from Ed Holt in the question. So it's around, can an agile culture be created without top-down leadership? Can it work, you know, at a local team level, you know, and then spread it, or is that just totally over-optimistic? Any perspectives? I'll open it up to the panelists.
So I think.
Go on, Simon.
So I think, yes, it can. So I think you can implement agile in days, weeks. You know, if you have a small contained group that all have a clear outcome, I think you can do. If you want to do it across a corporate, it will take, you know, years, because it is a complete mindset change. And I think the other thing is, agile is a very dangerous term. It's a bit like digital. Everyone has different opinions on it, and so I think first and foremost it's really understanding, what do people mean by agile, what do people fear about agile, what are people worried about, because sometimes people just say no to it or resist it because they just think it's going to be a bunch of cowboys running around releasing change and causing disruption everywhere, whereas actually you could start with proper plans in place, proper governance. You go, what are you worried about? Well, I need to use this hierarchy to control and to make sure that I can, mitigate the risk. Well, you can go, well, then we'll have a quarterly review and we'll show you this and we'll show you that. So I think listening to people and responding to their fears, I think, is the most important thing. So yes, I think you could do it in a small team as long as you are empowered and contained enough. But really, to be effective across the full scale, to manage those interdependencies that will inevitably start happening across teams, you do need top-down support, because they need to break the deadlock of those conversations and make sure that people can have a time box of when they need to get through everything.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. Good to get your perspective. Dan, I think you wanted to add something.
Just to build on that, I think you can. You will absolutely get the momentum, and it'll be great fun for you and the team. But there'll come a point where it won't be fun anymore, because you'll need some help, or you'll get the long screwdriver trying to play with your system from above, and they're asking the wrong questions. So I think absolutely, yeah, you can get started and build the momentum. But at some point, and I think probably in the next 5-10 years, what will be fantastic is a lot of people on the call who I'm guessing are more on board with the way of working will be part of the main boards and CEOs of these companies. And as soon as we get to that tipping point, life will become a lot easier, because ultimately you have people there who'll be willing to get involved in daily stand-ups to run their business. And certainly we're starting to see that even at Lloyds now. I think it's one of the comments earlier, and our audit team, believe it or not, is one of the most agile mindseted teams we've got. And it's fantastic now because they're the guys and girls who actually can go and study our system and look at where we've got issues, but they understand the philosophy. So, you know, it's been amazing to see that that's come from top-down leadership, if I'm honest.
Brilliant. Vikram, I just wanted to open it up to you. So we've had a comment come through the chat from Paul saying, I'm sorry, I disagree. If you do not have buy-in from senior management, then bottom-up will never work. Is that your perspective?
I guess it's just building on what Dan said. You know, you can optimize a delivery team, no problem, but you know, how long does it last? Because everyone's heard of psychological safety. We call it a clear and safe environment, but within a short space of time, those poor teams can get crushed with one question from a leadership team saying, "Show us your plan. Why did that go wrong?" Someone gets beaten because an experiment didn't work. And then suddenly you've completely defeated the team's poor efforts. And we've seen this over and over again. I know it's an easy thing to say, but I'd say you start off on both sides. And what we typically do is to engage with the leadership team and the delivery team in a very thin slice and get them going. So you've then got the leaders being able to quickly understand how the teams are feeling, and the teams are able to quickly escalate impediments, challenges, and then you've got something which actually can kind of reinforce itself and grow. And that's the way we see the most sustainable approach, which is a bit of a top-down and bottom-up at the same time, but very, very thin slice as an experiment.
Cool. Has anyone, any of the panelists really got any good experiences of where they've not been able to get the leadership support? And how have you managed to tackle that and turn it around?
Oh, can I just build on what Vikram was saying there, just before I'll pass that question to someone else?
Yeah.
We've been talking a little bit in the last week about flight levels at HL, and there's a really interesting analogy which I think really applies here around considering the different flight levels almost as a computer keyboard, and each team was being responsible, the flight levels being responsible for the rows of keys on a keyboard. Now, at a certain flight level, you can be so super optimized at delivering your keys on the keyboard, but if you're trying to write a letter and those different flight levels aren't optimized, then you're going to slow down very quickly if the levels above you aren't optimized. So absolutely, I think you can have teams that have that agile mindset and they're working very well, but they're going to very quickly be slowed down by the different flight levels if they're not optimized as well and they don't have that support.
Yeah.
I'll pass it to someone else for that.
Any perspectives?
I think my experience when you ask a question, Ben, I think something that Simon said actually as well. I think certainly for those of us who practice both ways of working, which I'm assuming most of us have, I think there is a piece around working with stakeholders to explain the language and thinking, how can you break it down into, be it a QBR, or how can you spin it in a way that they would then understand it? So I've certainly seen success in that, where you actually give the person, 1, 2, maybe 3 strikes. But there have also been times where I've got to number 4 or 5 strikes, and it's like, well, unfortunately, I'm going to have to sidestep you and go and find somebody who's an advocate to take care of the situation, which sounds very, I don't know, it's professional of me or not, but there have been cases where it's hard work, and that's where, going back to some of the comments in the thread and to Vikram's point, that that's where if you do have buy-in at that senior exec level, unfortunately in current society, that does make a massive difference, because they ultimately unblock that problem, that cultural problem, and it's a very real one. But I've certainly seen success when you actually go out and reach in and try and pull the person in to make sure you understand what their problem is with it, because 9 times out of 10 it's because they're being asked a question by their boss in the wrong way.
Yeah, I think I've definitely had several experiences of it being blocked, and I think ultimately, if it's the CEO, it's blocked. There's actually very little you can do. But I think if it's not the CEO, or if it's not an organization that is completely driven by the CEO, I think the smartest way you can do it is to Dan's point, not keep going, because actually you can antagonize people and you can make it a much bigger barrier than it actually needs to be. And the smartest way that, for example, we found in Sainsbury's was we just kept going with the real advocates, and then eventually they will tell the other people. And so it's not you telling the story, it's someone else. And I think, you know, there's some really interesting questions in the chat around middle management. I think ultimately you have to challenge yourself as to going, well, ultimately Agile is about having no hierarchy and empowering teams. So what is middle management? What are you using middle management for? And I think that's why there's resistance, because there is a fear, because people can see that actually if you want to empower teams, the role of middle management needs to significantly change, and it becomes a coaching level rather than anything else. And so if that middle management loves making decisions and driving change, and that role just, I don't think will exist in a truly agile business. Now that may be a bit too extreme, but I think that's where that's why there's resistance to change there. And also, to another option is, to Cormac's point, one option that we found was where there is a real concern around funding, or we're going to use funding to control you. Actually, you could flip it round and go, well, why don't you fund the outcome and then let us do whatever we need to do to meet that outcome. And then you don't need to worry about phased project funding and milestones and things like that. The milestones are based on outcomes that you then report on in QBRs or whatever governance you've agreed to give them that little slice of comfort that allows them to still feel there's that level of control. So I think there's lots and lots of different options you've got there. And the risk is that you throw it all out there and then people get overwhelmed with, well, hang on, now you're just ripping up the entire rule book and you're doing everything differently. So you need to figure out what's the biggest barrier to change and what's that first step that you can do to break down that one and then break down the next one. So I think one of the big risks of Agile is trying to do it too fast. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to try and find what's the best way to create a measured change across the business.
Cool. And that sorry, Vikram, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, going back to it, I'd say 9 out of 10 times, the leadership team and a lot of the clients that we work with are not exactly like going, yeah, I want to change, I want to do something fundamentally different from what I've done in the last 30 years. It's always a risk. And to Simon's point, I guess, is I completely agree. You've got to help the leaders experiment in a really safe environment, I think, because it is really uncomfortable and it's very risky from their perspective. And so, yeah, we try and work with leaders, try and do very small experiments just to get the thing going. The other couple of other interventions that we've seen really successful, not always works, but it's definitely been more successful than it hasn't, which is we do a lot of safaris with senior leaders to take them away and take them to go and see another organization. And it completely dispels a lot of their mental models of what is possible and what's not. That kind of just opens their eyes. And especially when you get peers speaking to peers, it does change things. And then the other one, which is slightly more painful for sometimes, is taking the leaders and taking them to the front line and getting them to have conversations. We did this with Sainsbury's, and obviously we did this with Hargreaves Lansdown, etc., is getting the leaders to go and speak to the teams as part of their Gemba walks, as just turn up to the demos, turn up to the retros and listen in to what the teams have got to say. And it does kind of highlight that it's not all perfect. And more often than not, they just don't have the time to go and do those things. But it does start opening their minds again about actually, what else could we do here to make this different?
Cool, thank you, Vikram. Amanda, if I could come to you, building culture, and especially an agile culture where, it's complicated and it takes time. I mean, what's your perspective on how long are we talking about?
I think mostly you're talking years, to be perfectly honest. I think culture change takes a long time. And I suspect that probably the older the organization, probably the longer it's going to take, because you've got more entrenched ideals, values, that you've been going longer. There's in some ways, there's a lot more to change. Whereas I think some of the younger, smaller organizations haven't necessarily got those deeply ingrained and embedded ideas and ways of doing things. They're not sort of hampered by history, if you like. And quite often they may be born to be slightly more nimble anyway, a little bit more open-minded, and also they're smaller. I think that's the other challenge with some of the those older organizations, is that they're massive institutions. There's hundreds or thousands of people in them, and I think, I don't know, from my experience in smaller organizations, it takes a long time. And that's a small, that's maybe something less than 200 people. So if you're talking something that's 2,000 people, 20,000 people, yeah, I think you're looking at years realistically.
And do you have any tips, Amanda, on some of the measures of how people can monitor the health of their agile culture? What have you seen typically that works?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? How do you actually measure culture? I mean, I guess things like engagement, I think, are really important. I think that's a very good indicator, certainly for a healthy culture. But I think, the kind of things that I think are important to measure generally are outcomes. Are you achieving the outcomes that you want? Are you being successful? But ultimately, we do have to make money, and that's kind of the benefit of Agile, is it's helping us to do that. I think cycle time is another one. That's, I think, a good indicator of your sort of efficiency. So cycle time or lead time. So yeah, outcomes, lead time, cycle time, and engagement, I think are three indicators. If those things are moving in the right direction, I think you're probably heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Amanda. Dan, any other perspectives on measurements?
I think those metrics are spot on. I think when you hear organisations talking about how productive are we, and then worrying about the numbers afterwards, then you're in business. And when I say productive, I mean more around the flow of your work. How quickly are you moving from definition ready to definition done? Do teams even know what that is? So when you see an organisation really moving to maturity, I think they talk more about speed of delivery than their cost of delivery, and ultimately start believing that the value will come. I was reflecting on the question about scaling and how long. The organisation I work with was 125,000 strong 7 years ago. It's now 65,000 strong, and it's continuing to evolve. And it's fascinating to see how the organisation's shrinking, but the agile techniques are coming on board more and more. And I think it's really interesting. I think it does take, some of it is systemic. It's not just about the people, it's actually how you organise your people. And people understanding that you have to change your operating model, organisational design, in order for the agile culture to flourish. If you keep too many people in too many jobs, people keep busy. So that's a real interesting one for big organisations to grapple with. And then I think the other one for me, I've seen a number of companies growing up small and then looking at big companies to copy. Because once they get to 300 people, I need a finance department, I need a PMO, I need and all of a sudden they start to bring in techniques. I saw it at Funding Circle. I don't know if anyone on the lines work there, but when I went and saw them, they started brilliant. But then I saw them about 7 months in, and they were hiring lots of bankers like me who used to run loan departments like me, and I could just see them building in SLAs back to where they. And you could just see it, and you're thinking, this is going to grind, because they're not. Who do you copy? I think, to Amanda's point, in this world, what does great look like if there's an organisation that has scaled and continued with the ethos? It's a really interesting conversation, and I don't know the answer to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Vikram, question for you, but are there any other challenges that you've seen that kind of help impede organizations in building their agile culture? We've talked about the role of leaders, how you can overcome some of that, but is there anything else that we should be mindful of?
Well, I'd probably just link to what Dan was saying about time, just patience. I think there's a lot of expectation on Agile. It delivers everything so quickly, and the next thing comes along. I mean, this is a multi-year journey. And if you look at the kind of the cemetery of other methodologies which have come and got, like Lean, I mean, if we all just applied Lean, 10, 20, 30 years ago, I mean, businesses would be really, really productive compared with many. And so it's that patience and resilience of just keep pushing and pushing. And we've got to acknowledge that there's so much happens in a few years' time. Leaders come and go. Various different ambassadors and champions disappear as well, and all create huge risk for the transformation itself. So just making sure that when you start these things, or just that constant mantra is this is going to take a long time, and we're in it for the long journey. I think that's the important thing.
I can't believe how quickly time has gone, but we've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask everybody, actually, so everyone on the call, to almost put into the chat like your one takeaway from this conversation that you've heard today, that actually you're going to start thinking about and applying to your organization to help strengthen the culture. So if you don't mind just having a think and jotting that down, it would be great to hear your thoughts. But I'm also going to ask the panelists to share theirs. So Richard, I'm going to come to you first, but what's your one piece of advice to everyone on this call, as something they can tangibly do to help strengthen that agile culture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think almost just building on what Vikram was saying there around patience, I think these things do take a long time. And I think if someone had said to me 5 years ago, this is how far we would have got in 5 years, then I probably would have got quite disheartened by that. But these things do take time, and you just have to persist with it. There are some difficult challenges along the way, for sure there are, but it's absolutely worth it.
Brilliant. Okay, so patience. Simon, if I could come to you, what's your one bit of advice?
So I'm going to give something completely different to everything I've talked about so far, and it would be, don't assume that you know everything. So I think one of the things that I do first whenever I enter an organization is get a sentiment score from all of the team, and it's a very simple survey. It's one question. It's give me a mark out of 10 of how you're feeling, and then a free text field. And that free text field, they can write whatever they want. They can go, I hate this person, or I want to change this, or this is great. And the amount of information you get back, it's not something you can do for very long because people get frustrated by it, but really understanding the context of what you are trying to change, I think, is the most important starting point for everything. So I'd recommend people try not, there is a fear, there's that fear and there's an arrogance about when you've either been in a business so long or you're worried about changing it. So doing something very, very simple like that I would be my recommendation.
Super, thank you, Simon. Amanda, can I come to you and hear your one bit of advice to everyone?
I think mine would probably be start small. Any small corner of the organization where you can do something and get something working, some kind of proof of concept that you can use to start socializing some of the benefits, create some advocates, start creating a bit of awareness. That would be my top tip, I think. Brilliant, thank you, Amanda. Vikram?
I agree with Amanda. It's creating that safe environment for an experiment. It's too intimidating sometimes to go on these journeys, especially because if you've got lots of legacy around. So starting with an experiment, but doing it taking a vertical slice from the leaders through to a frontline team, and get them going and monitor the behaviour at all times, and use that to retrospect and improve.
Thank you, Vikram. And then finally, Dan.
I agree with all the comments before. I think just to throw something different into at the end is to look out and seek out learning like this always, but also build those connections with like-minded people. Because if you start the movement in your organisation, it's amazing what that holds, and get a lot of like-minded people together to talk about it. It can have a big impact.
Brilliant, thank you, Dan. Well, just to wrap up, I guess what I've heard from the conversation today is that it's really important that organisations invest in building their culture. And I think what's come out super strongly in what you've said is that the business case is there. You can build stronger products, better services, and really have that business impact that leads to the pounds and pence impact. I think to have an impact at scale, what I've heard is that yes, you can start small and create that momentum, but fundamentally at some point you will need the leaders to be on board with that to have that scaled impact. It will take time, but of course we've heard it's worth experimenting. And then I love what Simon kind of talked about in his tip of just start measuring it actually and get people's perspectives, but also having the dialogue in those retrospectives, I think, has really come out quite strongly in this. So thank you for that, and thank you for everyone that shared their tip. And hopefully you've had a chance to just look at some of the other ideas, because of course this is all about stealing with pride. So I think we're at time, so I just want to say thank you to our amazing panelists, so Amanda, Dan, Vikram, Simon, Richard. It's been super to get your thoughts and your perspectives this afternoon, and thank you to everyone kind of contributing with your questions. And then as ABC, JCURV and Truthsayers, we'll be hosting more of these panel discussions on agile culture, and I think the plan is to have something in April, May time, thinking more about public sector, education, some of the sectors that have come out in the report as not being as strong in their agile culture, what can be done specifically in those sectors but we'd also love to hear about what you'd like to talk about. So I know we'll follow up with a feedback form, but we'd love to hear your thoughts of other topics that you'd want support and input on as well. So thank you all, and have a happy rest of Thursday. See you soon.